Scripture contains 4 Gospels, meaning we've got 4 biographies of the life of Jesus. They're the same story, just told from 4 different perspectives: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the Exodus is the melody. It is the soundtrack that plays beneath each one of those stories. Matthew is probably the most obvious. In his first 5 chapters, Matthew replays all of the Exodus highlights through the scenes of Jesus' life. He describes the baptism of Jesus that began his ministry as a wind-guided passage through the waters. That is a direct reference back to the crossing of the Red Sea, the climactic scene of Exodus. And from there, Jesus is driven by the Spirit into the wilderness for 40 days of testing, mirroring Israel's 40 days of wilderness wandering in Exodus. Then, of course, comes the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus climbs to a high mountain to deliver a new law. You have heard that it was said, but I tell you, Jesus quotes and quotes again and again from the law of Moses to offer a new Torah. John summarizes, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. It's Exodus language for a new Exodus deliverer with a new covenant. The Gospel of Matthew is set to the soundtrack of Exodus. Then comes Mark. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up to a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before him. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Now, both Moses and Elijah had life-defining encounters with God on that very mountain. In Moses' case, his face began to glow brightly, just like Jesus' clothing is doing in this passage, that he had to wear a veil afterward just so people could look at him. The transfiguration, which is recorded here by Mark and elsewhere by Matthew and Luke, is an Exodus reenactment. The last major Exodus reenactment before the most obvious one, when Jesus replaced the Passover meal commanded by Moses in the Exodus with what we call the Last Supper or communion or the Lord's table today commanded in the Gospels. Do you hear the melody? Then there's Luke. Of all the Gospel writers, Luke devoted the most real estate to the birth of Jesus. Exodus is the story of Moses, a child who was hidden in a basket, a deliverer born under the command of a genocide by an insecure tyrant. Then Luke is the story of Jesus, a child hidden in a manger, a new deliverer born under the commanded genocide of a new insecure tyrant. Moses, a Jewish child, then grew up in Egypt, in Pharaoh's house of all places, saving his life. Jesus, a Jewish child, grew up in Egypt, a refugee who escaped from Herod's house, saving his life. Luke's account of Jesus' glowing transfiguration, that Moses reenactment, it reads this way. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor talking with Jesus. They spoke about his Exodus, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. And Luke's final scene is an appearance of the resurrected Jesus to his disciples in the upper room where he says this is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. But John's gospel is my favorite. John's gospel opens like this. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. It's poetic to us today, but it was scandalous when he penned it. The Hebrew word for glory is kavod, and it's a word you'll find all over the Old Testament. It is a one-word summary for the weight, greatness, and power of God. Moses once famously asked God to see his glory, his kavod, and that request was denied. You cannot see my face. No one can see my face and live, says Yahweh. In context, no one can look at my kavod, my glory, without dropping dead on the spot. But I will let you look at my back. That's all you can handle. New Testament scholar Friedland Steer says this is the apex, the ultimate, the extreme allowed to any theology, any philosophy, and any scholarship, the back of God, provided they really desire to see his face. You see, that kind of reverence, that's the community that John is writing to. And then John, writing among a people who held such reverence for God, they trembled at his presence, dared not look at his face, begins his story. We have seen his kavod, his glory, the glory of the one and only Son. The glory that would have killed Moses on the spot, I've seen it, says John. And you have too. That's the scandal of his poetry. He's saying that face, the common one with bags under his tired eyes and a crooked nose and beads of sweat on his forehead, that is the face that Moses could not look at and stay on his own 2 feet. William Barclay writes, this is possibly the greatest single verse in the New Testament and certainly the sentence for which John wrote his whole gospel. Jesus is the kavod, the glory of Yahweh, disguised in human flesh. And John's imagery for Christ's first arrival is later borrowed by the Apostle Paul for Christ's promised second arrival. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Glory came disguised as one of us that we might become like him. He will come again and he will show us that glory, now no longer in disguise, but glowing in plain view. I've taken you on a journey through the whole of the Bible to simply say this: Exodus. That is the melody that the life of God moves to. It's the melody beneath all the promises of God that are fulfilled in Jesus, and it's the melody beneath all the promises of God whose full fulfillment we still await in Jesus' return.